It was meant to be routine, an internal reshuffling of royal properties, but what began as a quiet request from the king exploded into one of the most shocking royal standoffs in recent memory. Because when Edward and Sophie received the letter, they didn't just decline, they defied. And behind that defiance lies a storm years in the making. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The request arrived without warning. A letter, hand-delivered by a senior aide from the palace, wrapped in the usual language of duty and transition. The official explanation was clear. Charles intended to optimize royal residences in line with current responsibilities and future costs. Bagshot Park, according to the King's Council, was no longer strategically viable. But to Edward and Sophie, the message was far more personal. Relocate, or be erased. Sophie reportedly didn't wait for further clarification. Upon reading the letter, she is said to have stared at the aide and replied, "No, this is unjustifiable. Absolutely not." The words weren't shouted, they didn't need to be. For a woman known for her restraint, that response echoed louder than any public outburst. For Edward, it wasn't just the request, it was the way it was delivered. No conversation, no heads up. After decades of unwavering loyalty, stepping in when others stepped back, this felt like a betrayal cloaked in bureaucracy. Sources close to the couple claim Edward was stunned, his disappointment not rooted in pride, but in the quiet realization that his service, once valued, had been silently weighed and dismissed. Bagshot Park wasn't just home, it was a symbol of the life they'd built far from the drama of royal spotlight. It had been promised, not merely inherited. Behind palace walls, the rejection was not only unexpected, it was seismic. Senior aides reportedly scrambled to contain the fallout, as word of the refusal began to circulate among royal staff. Some tried to downplay it as a misunderstanding, others knew better. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of something larger, a challenge to the authority of a monarch whose every move was being watched, dissected, and increasingly questioned. And while Edward and Sophie didn't speak publicly, their silence was its own statement, measured, deliberate, and filled with meaning. But this wasn't about property, it was about power, legacy, and a line that had finally been crossed. To most, it's just a quiet estate in Surrey. But within royal circles, Bagshot Park holds deep, unspoken weight. It's where loyalty lives, where promises were made, and where one royal couple carved out a life on the margins of the monarchy. Taking it back wasn't just a logistical decision. It was a symbolic power play. Bagshot Park wasn't handed out lightly. Queen Elizabeth II personally granted the residence to Edward and Sophie, not just as a place to live, but as a reward for a different kind of service, quiet, steadfast, undramatic. In a royal family often torn between headlines and tradition, the Wessexes represented something rare. Calm. They didn't chase cameras. They didn't trade in controversy. Instead, they quietly built their life in the background, and Bagshot became their retreat, their fortress, their answer to the chaos that swirled endlessly around the crown. Inside those walls, children were raised, royal duties were fulfilled without fanfare, and scandals were pointedly avoided. To them, Bagshot wasn't a building, it was their identity. But, from the very beginning, Charles never fully embraced the symbolism. To him, Bagshot represented a branch of the monarchy that didn't quite align with his vision. He saw efficiency, visibility, streamlined relevance. And more importantly, it gave Edward and Sophie a measure of autonomy that, to some in Charles's inner circle, felt increasingly inconvenient. Rumours began circulating months ago. Whispered plans, real estate assessments, reports from royal strategists who viewed the estate as underleveraged. And quietly, almost invisibly, Bagshot started appearing on a list of properties being considered for reassignment. Speculation grew louder when Prince William's team began looking for new operational hubs. With Catherine's growing influence and the couple's expanding role in the monarchy's public strategy, proximity to Windsor became crucial. And what stood just 20 minutes away from Windsor Castle untouched by tourists, secure and royally zoned, Bagshot Park. The very mention of its possible reassignment was enough to ignite alarm behind closed doors. For Edward and Sophie, this wasn't theoretical, it was personal. Especially for Sophie, who, in a private letter unearthed by a former staff member, once referred to Bagshot as their sanctuary from the noise. A line that, in hindsight, revealed just how deeply the estate had been woven into the fabric of their lives. And while official statements were nowhere to be found, the silence from Buckingham said enough. This wasn't about optimizing space. It was a shift in power, a decision that would strip the Wessexes of not only their home, but their place in a monarchy that had, for too long, failed to see the value in quiet strength. Charles believed he was making a practical move. What he didn't anticipate was the emotional line he'd crossed and the quiet fury it would unleash. But what the king didn't anticipate was just how far Edward and Sophie would go to protect it and what they'd reveal to do so. No microphones, no cameras, just a quiet conversation between two people who've seen too much. But someone was listening, and what they heard was enough to send the entire palace scrambling. Because when Edward confessed what he feared Charles was planning next, the betrayal ran far deeper than a postcode. It began in the late evening, long after the official business of the day had ended. Inside the walls of Bagshot Park, Edward and Sophie spoke candidly for the first time since the king's relocation letter had arrived. But what should have remained a private conversation between husband and wife would soon become royal dynamite. A trusted household staffer, someone long considered loyal, overheard enough to understand the stakes. Enough to panic. Because Edward, known for his reserve, didn't hold back. His voice, tinged with disbelief, carried a line no one expected to hear. "He's not just taking the house, he's erasing us." It wasn't about walls or land. It was about legacy, inheritance, erasure. And in that moment, the man who had stood in quiet support of the crown for decades sounded like someone watching the institution turn its back on him. But Sophie's words cut deeper still. Frustrated, protective, and visibly shaken, she reportedly said something few in the royal family would ever admit aloud, that Diana's sons were being elevated, again and again, while the Queen's youngest was being sidelined. "This family," she is believed to have said, "is becoming one narrative, and we are no longer part of it." It was a sentence loaded with pain, history, and the undercurrent of years spent working in the shadows of louder headlines. To the staffer who overheard it all, the tension was unbearable. And whether out of concern or calculation, that staffer told someone. And that someone told someone else. By morning, the whispers had become echoes. Within 48 hours, a version of the conversation had found its way to the press, not the exact words, but the tone, the sentiment, the core betrayal. They were out. And when the public read the headlines, something unexpected happened. Sympathy began shifting. It wasn't just about Charles anymore. It was about fairness, about a family devouring its own to maintain an image, about the kind of loyalty that never makes the front page finally being brought into the light. Online forums exploded. Commentators rehashed the years of loyal service Edward and Sophie had given, with barely a fraction of the recognition afforded to others. Polls began surfacing, subtly questioning the king's judgment, his favoritism, his sudden coldness. Inside Buckingham Palace, chaos rippled beneath the surface. Charles was livid. Not just about the leak, but the timing, the narrative spiral, and most of all, what it revealed about how deeply this decision had wounded those he thought would never speak out. He saw it as sabotage. Others saw it as exposure. And for the first time, the king's inner circle had to reckon with the idea that this wasn't just a logistical crisis. It was a family fracture too deep to bury. But while Charles fought to control the narrative, another royal stepped forward, one who'd kept quiet for too long. She rarely interferes. She rarely needs to. But when Princess Anne found out what Charles had done, she didn't hesitate. Her words were sharp, deliberate, and final. "You don't do that to Edward." And just like that, an unexpected alliance shattered the palace's carefully laid plans. Anne had built her reputation on discipline, on silence. duty, and an almost military resistance to drama. She was the royal who never flinched, never indulged, never veered from her role. But even Anne has her limits. And when she learned that Charles had issued a relocation request to Edward and Sophie without warning, without consultation, and without context, she stepped into the fire. No intermediaries, no aides. Just a direct conversation with the king behind closed doors, where she made it clear that this wasn't just a miscalculation, it was a betrayal. She reminded him of the promises made not just by the crown, but by their late parents. After Prince Philip's passing, Edward was meant to inherit more than just a ceremonial title. He was meant to inherit space freedom, a position in the family that recognized his unwavering service and quiet loyalty. This move, Anne argued, was the opposite. It was a message that loyalty had an expiration date. Anne didn't stop there. She invoked Sophie, a woman she'd long admired not for her noise, but for her silence. For the years Sophie spent holding ground without headlines, without scandal, without fail. Anne respected that. In a palace where spectacle had often replaced substance, Sophie had remained a figure of grounded, understated strength. Removing them from their home, Anne argued, wasn't about logistics. It was about diminishing those who had never asked for more than space to serve. Charles was caught off guard. He hadn't expected resistance from Anne, and certainly not with this level of conviction. She warned him, calmly, but without compromise, that the monarchy could not afford to alienate the few members who still operated without personal agenda. She reminded him that unity wasn't about obedience, it was about respect. And without it, the foundation begins to crack. Her words began to echo beyond that private conversation. In council meetings, subtle shifts appeared. Advisors who once nodded silently began to exchange glances. The undercurrent of unease became something more. Factions formed not openly, not dramatically, but with a quiet resolve that said more than any speech ever could. But what changed everything wasn't what Anne said in private. It was what she did in public. For the first time, she made a pointed comment during an official engagement, praising Edward's work on behalf of the Duke of Edinburgh's legacy and calling him a pillar of continuity. It wasn't lost on anyone. It was the signal, subtle but seismic, that the Princess Royal had taken a side. And not just taken it, but declared it. And as allies emerged from the shadows, it became clear Edward and Sophie weren't just resisting a move. They were making a statement. Long before titles and palaces, there was survival. Edward and Sophie didn't rise through scandal or headlines, they endured through silence. And now, as pressure mounts to uproot them, their marriage is becoming the monarchy's last unbreakable bond. In the royal world, power is often measured by visibility, by how loud one speaks, how often they appear on front pages, how dramatically they shift public opinion. But for Edward and Sophie, the path to significance was built in the opposite direction. When they first married, the press gave them little room to breathe. Every step was scrutinized, every gesture magnified, and Sophie, unlike others who sought the spotlight, shrank from it. She faltered at first. The palace expected a smooth transition, but Sophie faced quiet battles. Missteps turned into headlines. Rumors painted her as unprepared. But Edward didn't walk away. Instead, he took a step back himself, reducing his public engagements, quietly shielding her from the worst of it, not with statements, but with presence. What followed wasn't a resurgence, it was a rebuilding. While others in the family fought wars in tabloids, Edward and Sophie chose a quieter route. They didn't lobby for headlines. They took the assignments no one wanted: long hours, low exposure, maximum impact. Over time, Queen Elizabeth II began to take notice. While others drew attention, Edward and Sophie offered something rare: consistency. It was that loyalty, that refusal to exploit royal privilege, that earned them trust. Their bond wasn't strategic, it was earned in silence, over years of being overlooked, underestimated, and yet never walking away. This is why Bagshot Park mattered. It wasn't a fortress, it was a reward, a place not just of residence, but of recognition. It symbolized everything they had built together: not as media figures, but as the monarchy's quiet spine. And now, to be asked to leave, it felt like being told they no longer belonged in the house they helped keep standing. Friends close to Sophie revealed that behind her composed exterior, she was shaken, but not broken. In a moment of rare vulnerability, she confided to a longtime confidant, "We've given everything. This is where we draw the line." It wasn't a threat. It was a reckoning. They had survived too much, weathered too many private storms, to be pushed aside without consequence. The pressure outside may have been mounting, but inside that house, the resolve was growing stronger. Their marriage, their journey, their scars, they had all led to this moment. And this time, they wouldn't meet silence with silence. They would resist with dignity, with history behind them, and with a quiet understanding that if they didn't stand now, there might be nothing left worth protecting. But not everyone inside the palace agreed with their defiance, and one quiet figure began drafting an ultimatum. As Charles debated, Camilla acted. With a few words and a discreet signature, she escalated the situation behind the scenes. What was framed as logistical housekeeping was, in truth, a quiet removal operation, and it bore her fingerprints. While the king's request still lingered in the air unanswered but not forgotten, Camilla made her move in silence. There was no dramatic proclamation, no official directive issued from Buckingham Palace. Instead, subtle shifts began to take place at Bagshot Park. Inventory specialists, operating under the guise of routine audits, arrived without introduction. Long-time staff who had become part of Edward and Sophie's inner rhythm were abruptly reassigned, their goodbyes rushed, their explanations vague. These weren't just clerical changes, they were calculated displacements. And none of it came from Charles directly. Every maneuver, every whisper of disruption, was traced back to a private channel overseen by the Queen Consort's team. The true turning point came when service providers began reaching out, confused, concerned. Scheduled maintenance, floral contracts, catering liaisons paused, not delayed, cancelled. Sophie's confusion turned to suspicion, and then to disbelief, as she realized no one had informed them. Not directly, not officially. Word reached her not through palace channels, but through a sympathetic contact who warned her plainly. The relocation wasn't being discussed. It was already in motion. Sophie's world, once private and quietly preserved, was being dismantled without her consent and without her even knowing. The revelation struck Edward hard. He'd assumed, perhaps naively, that silence from the top meant space to negotiate. But when he confronted a senior aide, demanding to know who had authorized these covert moves, the response was cold and clear. "You'll need to speak to Her Majesty's team," the aide replied. It was confirmation that stung deeper than expected, not only because Camilla had intervened, but because it had been done with such precision, such finality. She hadn't waited for a stalemate. She had triggered the endgame. And yet, publicly, Camilla remained a picture of composure. No statement, no visible involvement. But those close to the palace claim she dismissed the entire property as wasted space, a pointed remark that revealed not just disregard, but disdain. For her, Bagshot Park wasn't legacy or loyalty. It was an asset, and one that no longer served her purpose. That subtle but ruthless view, whispered behind closed doors, explained everything. The strategy wasn't to ask Edward and Sophie to leave, it was to make staying impossible. The gloves were off, and what had begun as quiet resistance was about to go public in a way no one anticipated. The document wasn't supposed to exist. But once it surfaced, there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. A leaked memo, marked "Private Eyes Only," confirmed the worst. The move wasn't about efficiency, it was about consolidation and control. It appeared overnight, no warning, no attribution, but its authenticity was undeniable. Stamped with internal palace insignia, signed by a senior planning official, and buried deep within a modernization brief intended only for the king's inner circle, the memo outlined a stark vision for the monarchy's future. A future streamlined, trimmed, and ruthlessly controlled. Under the heading Phase 4, Residence Rationalization, It listed royal properties by classification: essential, transitional, and expendable. Bagshot Park fell into the last category. For Edward and Sophie, the word was more than a bureaucratic term. It was an insult. After decades of quiet loyalty, steady service, and deliberate avoidance of scandal, they were now labelled surplus to requirements. But it wasn't just the personal slight that ignited the firestorm. It was what the memo revealed about Charles's deeper intentions. The document detailed a plan to reduce the number of active royal residences to just 4. Everything else would be either repurposed, leased, or shuttered altogether. The justification was cloaked in modernity, but the subtext was unmistakable. Fewer voices, fewer rival centres of influence, and absolute control centralised under the king and his direct heirs. The leak couldn't have come at a worse time for the palace. Public sympathy had already begun leaning toward Edward and Sophie, especially among older royalists who revered Queen Elizabeth's quiet faith in her youngest son. Now, with written proof that the couple had been targeted not for inefficiency but for elimination, the outrage was palpable. Commentators on morning broadcasts openly questioned the fairness of it. Social media surged with emotional tributes to Edward and Sophie's service. Hashtags began trending. And then came the petition. What started as a small gesture ballooned into a movement, demanding the king reverse course and formally protect Bagshot Park as a legacy estate honouring the late Queen's wishes. Inside the palace, aides scrambled. Official statements were drafted, redrafted, then shelved entirely. No wording seemed to dampen the backlash without admitting the truth. They claimed the memo was a misinterpretation, that no final decisions had been made, that the king respected all his siblings equally. But the damage had already sunk in. The language of the leak was too cold, too precise. Expendable. That word stuck. It echoed across headlines and dominated airwaves, and with every passing hour, the narrative spun further out of the palace's control. Meanwhile, media outlets seized the opportunity to stoke the flames. Reporters revived old rumours of tension between Charles and his siblings, particularly Edward. Others speculated whether this was the first phase of a broader push to isolate anyone not directly in line to the throne. Even foreign press weighed in, painting the British monarchy as locked in a silent civil war. Bagshot Park became the symbol of something bigger, of who belonged in the future monarchy and who didn't. But even as the press turned, the decision rested with one man who suddenly realised he may have gone too far. He thought they'd fold. That tradition and hierarchy would silence rebellion. But when Edward and Sophie held their ground and the public rallied, King Charles had no choice but to reconsider. And behind his silence lay a quiet recognition. Loyalty isn't inherited. It's earned. There was no statement, no retraction, no ceremony, just a sudden and telling absence of action. The relocation order, once pulsing through corridors and creeping into staff memos, vanished like it had never existed. Calls stopped. Schedules changed. And while no one dared to say it outright, it was clear. The king had backed down, not with a bang, but with the unmistakable silence of retreat. Behind the scenes, aides were redirected, property reviews redirected elsewhere, and Bagshot Park quietly slipped off the list of royal estates, under review. The shift wasn't broadcast, but it was felt. Instead of Bagshot being prepared for departure, another royal residence quietly changed hands. One previously eyed for consolidation was now being offered to a different family member, a strategic diversion to maintain the image of progress without sparking further outrage. But it didn't go unnoticed that Edward and Sophie remained untouched, not elevated, not vindicated, simply left alone. And in the royal family, being left alone can speak louder than any title. Sophie learned the news not from Charles, but from Princess Anne. A brief, direct message passed along with characteristic restraint. It wasn't even a conversation. But in the language of monarchy, it was confirmation. And for Sophie, that message coming from Anne, and not the crown, carried even more weight. It was personal, human, and rooted in something more genuine than protocol. Edward, for his part, made no move to reconcile. When offered a private audience with the king to discuss future roles, he declined. A decision that sent quiet shockwaves through senior courtiers who had expected a gracious, conciliatory end to the episode. But Edward's refusal wasn't about vengeance. It was a message. That silence and loyalty are not to be mistaken for subservience. That even the quietest royals can draw lines and stand behind them. Publicly, the palace maintained its usual composure. But royal watchers knew what had transpired. They called it the quietest retreat of his reign. In a monarchy obsessed with bloodlines and seniority, it was a rare instance of merit forcing a course correction. For King Charles, the decision to halt the relocation wasn't just about avoiding a press disaster. It was an admission tacit but unmistakable that the strength of the crown doesn't come from controlling every room in the palace. It comes from knowing who will still stand beside you when the walls start to crack. And in Edward and Sophie, that quiet strength had been tested and proven unshakable. But what remained wasn't just property or titles, it was a fundamental shift in the monarchy's internal power map. Edward and Sophie stayed. The king retreated. But the damage wasn't undone. It was written into the foundation of the house itself. Because this wasn't just a disagreement. It was a fracture. And behind every palace wall now hangs the same unspoken truth. This crown is no longer unquestioned. In the quiet aftermath, the silence wasn't peace, it was separation. Conversations became shorter, meetings more selective, invitations, once routine, were now weighed, second-guessed, delayed. The royal family, so often seen as a singular, seamless institution, had begun to split beneath the surface. The division wasn't loud. It wasn't formal, but it was permanent. Charles, once surrounded by siblings who had stood beside him in the Queen's final days, found himself more alone than ever. Trust had thinned. Warmth had cooled. For Charles, the lesson came with a cost. His siblings, Anne, Edward, even occasionally Andrew, had not questioned his reign. But they had expected balance. Respect. And when that was broken, the consequences weren't fiery rebellion or resignation. A quiet, measured pulling away that left the king at the center of the institution, but increasingly on the outside of his own family. Behind closed doors, even staff had begun whispering of changes. Who had the king's ear now? Who had walked away for good? William, the heir, chose silence, but it wasn't neutral. Publicly, he kept to the script. No statements, no interventions. But those close to him noted the tension, the hesitation. His relationship with his uncle and aunt had always been respectful, if not close. But now a new uncertainty had crept in. Was he next? Would his vision for the monarchy clash with theirs? And more urgently, had his father's move made his own future more fragile? The heir had grown used to walking a careful line. But now, the line itself seemed to be splitting beneath his feet. And in that growing vacuum, Sophie's presence expanded not officially, but unmistakably. She stepped into engagements with a newfound gravity. Not louder, not flashier, just firmer. Every handshake, every quiet statement seemed to carry more weight than before. She didn't seek authority, but it followed her. And the public noticed. In her, many saw not a rebel, but a reminder, a link to the Queen's legacy that wasn't wrapped in spectacle or controversy. A woman who had remained loyal when others fled, who endured criticism and neglect without ever striking back. Now, she stood taller, not because she was elevated, but because the institution around her had narrowed. Among royal watchers, a new phrase began to circulate. The Queen's true heirs in spirit, not in title, not in bloodline, but in loyalty, in work, in quiet dignity. Edward and Sophie, once dismissed as background figures, had become symbols, and symbols, once awakened, are hard to silence. Their refusal to move was no longer just a domestic dispute, it had become a national parable. Inside the palace, aides began to murmur what the public hadn't yet dared to ask. It wouldn't be about space or prestige, it would be about legacy, about succession. about who holds the true center of gravity in a monarchy reshaped by loss and silence. The question wasn't whether another confrontation would come. It was who would survive it. Because in the end, the refusal wasn't just about a home. It was about the future and the royals who refused to be erased. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.